Section 16 of the Story of Cairo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Cairo by Stanley Lane-Poole. Section 16. Chapter 8, The City of the Arabian Nights, Part 1. In the preceding chapter, we finished the story of Cairo as the capital of an independent state and described some of the beautiful buildings with which the Mamluk, sultans and nobles adorned the city. But the life of a town does not consist in the doings of the court, and we should form a very incomplete picture of medieval Cairo if we look no deeper than the sultans and their mosques and colleges and tombs. Though trampled under the hoofs of the dominant troopers, the city had a vigorous life of its own, a life of prosperous commerce, of social enjoyment, and of literary culture. Cairo society was no longer the limited palace coterie cooped up within the high walls of the Fatimid palaces. It spread on all sides save the east. It had flowed out beyond the northern gates and formed the new suburb of the Hosseiniyya, where many mosques and chapels grew up. It had spread to the west over the space between the old Fatimid wall and the Nile, and the river had conveniently receded and allowed the new port of Balak and a whole colony of houses to be formed on what had been the Nile bed, till the wreck of the good ship Elephant helped to make a sandbank called the Elephant's Isle, Gezerat el-Fil, which altered the river's course and provided an excellent building site. To the south, the space between the Fatimid walls and the citadel and the mosque of Ibn Tulun, where only gardens and summer villas and pools flooded at high Nile had been seen in Saladin's day, was now covered with houses, among which rose the domes and minarets of the Mamluks. The expansion of the city may readily be traced in the topographer's careful record of the building of mosques, which necessarily implies a neighboring population. The Mosque of Yunus, c. A.H. 719, and of Ibn et Tabak, the son of Nasir's cook, 746, in the quarter of El-Luk, pointed to the recession of the Nile, which formerly ran close by. In the same way, the foundation of the mosques of Ibn Ghazi, 741, and at Tawashi, 745, on the outside or west of the old Babel Bar, and the Zawiya of Abbas Suud, around 724, outside the Bab el-Kantara, point to a westward extension, though here the land was not formerly under water. The great expansion to the north, caused by the upheaval of the Elephant's Isle before 1200 A.D., and the emergence of Balak a century later, may be fully traced in the annals of the mosques. Makrizi tells us that the Elephant's Isle was flooded only at high Nile, and during the rest of the year it was a links of sandbanks and coarse grass, where the Mamluks used to practice archery in their unhappy ignorance of golf. But as the Nile receded, quote, people began in 1313 to erect houses in consequence of the improvements made in that part by Nasir, end of quote, who had dug the new canal, then known as the Khalig an Nasiri, and now as the Ismailiyya, which drained the tract. Quote, and a proclamation was made in Cairo and Misr, inviting everyone to build there without delay. So the emirs and soldiers and merchants and common folk built houses there, and Balak was created at this period. End of quote. He adds that water was drawn from the Nile by a Sakaya wheel, which stood on the spot where the mosque of El Khatiri was afterwards built, which shows that the river has not retreated much since, for it still runs very near this mosque, which was founded by I-Demir in 737 on a site which was under water 30 years before. Other mosques at Balak were those of Ibn Sarim and El Basiti, 817. Behind or east of Balak, on what is now called the Abbasiyah Road, was a plot of land beside the Elephant's Isle, known as Ard et Tabala, or the demesne of the Tamburina, because it was presented by the Caliph Mustansir to a singing girl who celebrated the glories of the Fatimids to the accompaniment of her drum. There also houses began to be built, and the Mosque of El Khemakti was founded there on the new canal in A.H. 790. Before this, another mosque, that of El Asiyuti, had been erected about 740 on the Elephant's Isle, as well as that of Saruga on the new canal near the pool of Ratli. Still further to the east, we find a number of mosques rising in the new quarters outside the old city walls. Such were the Gamis of Al-Malik, 732, and Ibn el-Falek in the Hoseinia quarter, those of Akush and Ibn el-Maghrabi on the canal outside, the convents of Yunus, Al-Gebuga, around 750, and Ibn Gurub, 798, and the Zawiyas of El-Gabari, around 687, Nasr, around 719, El-Kalendaria, around 722, and El-Kilati, around 737, outside the Bab and Nasr, all of which testified to the expansion of the city towards the north. Cairo had in fact attained much the same dimensions as it measured 50 years ago, before the new European suburbs near the Nile were developed. There was probably little difference either in outward aspect or in the life of the middle and lower classes between the Cairo of the 15th century and the city which Europeans such as Wilkinson, Burckhardt, Lane, John Philip, and Hay visited and described or painted in the first half of the 19th. Some of Hay's and his companions' O.B. Carter's drawings, sketched about 1830, are here reproduced, and they may fairly be taken as true representations of a town which still retained its essential medieval characteristics. How different Cairo must then have appeared to the newly arrived visitor who landed at Balak after coming through the Mahmadiyah Canal from Alexandria and then ascending the Nile. There was a mile's ride from the river bank at Balak to the Bab el Hadid, by which you entered Cairo at the northwest corner, and instead of the crowded villa suburb of today, there was scarcely a house to be seen. Quote, two principal roads, writes Lane, of nearly the same length, led from Balak to Cairo. The northern, which is somewhat irregular, but is the chief route of commerce, there were of course no railways then, leads to the Bab el Hadid, and the southern, after having crossed two canals, enters the western side of the Ezbekaya. We pass the picturesque mosque of Abul Ola on our right as we enter the latter road. The French, during their occupation of Egypt, raised this road, intending also to continue it through the town as far as the citadel. It is straight and wide, but very uneven, and wanting a row of trees on its southern side to shade it. It is raised a few feet above the level of the plain, so as to be above the reach of the inundation. On either side during the inundation are marshes and inundated fields. These, as soon as the waters have subsided, are sown with corn, beans, trefoil, etc. Here and there are clusters of palm trees and a few sycamores and acacias. The plain was formerly bounded on the east by extensive mounds of rubbish, doubtless the ruins of mocks, behind which the capital was nearly concealed. The road crosses two canals, over each of which is a stone bridge. Along the western side of the second canal, on the right of the road, is a long ridge of rubbish. From the top of this ridge, about a quarter of a mile from the gate of the Ezbekaya, we obtain a view of Cairo. This was how one approached Cairo in the first half of the 19th century. The description reads drearily enough, but it has the merit of showing what the place was like before the European builder took it in hand. When the traveler plodded along the uneven road between the bean fields in 1835, he was traversing precisely the same scene as had been trodden by the Mamluk horsemen for centuries, and he was approaching a city which was still, to all intents, the city of the Arabian Nights. There is no manner of doubt, from internal evidence, that it was in Cairo that these famous tales took their definite shape. Their origins have of course been traced to a large extent in Persia and India, but their final form and color are Egyptian. Though many of the scenes are laid at Baghdad, where the famous Harun-ur-Rashid played so conspicuous and erratic a part, it is obvious to any student of the topography that the writers were very imperfectly acquainted with the Caliph's city. It is Cairo that they know and describe whatever names they please to give to their scenes. There are incidental touches that make it probable that the Arabian Nights assumed their present form in all essentials before the middle of the 14th century. The latest historical personage mentioned is Saladin, and there are many reasons for believing that the tales were collected and written very nearly in their final shape during the revival of letters that ennobled the golden age of Mamluk civilization on the Nile. The society they describe is precisely what we know of Mamluk times. It is Orthodox Muslim society of the Cairene type. It may be wondered that there should be any speculation at all about the date of so famous a book, but the explanation is simple. Scholars and learned men in the East have always looked with contempt upon stories such as these, which are wholly devoid of the literary preciosity which was the special pride of the true man of letters. Hence they did not deign even to mention the 1001 Nights, save in 2 or 3 slight references which do not determine the date of the existing redaction. The Nights were written for the people, for the audiences who gathered in the coffee shops to listen to the professional reciter, for the large, uneducated middle class of Cairo. This is what constitutes their special merit in the eyes of the student of medieval Egypt. The doings of the kings and emirs we learn from the detailed pages of Makrizi and many other scholarly writers. It is from the 1001 Nights that we gain our insight into the life of the people, a life divided from that of the great by a gulf over which the Oriental historian rarely leaps. The tales are above all the adventures of merchants and shopkeepers. We are introduced, no doubt, to caliphs and sultans and viziers, as well as to the jinn, efrits, and marids, and other members of the spirit world. But the real actors in the stories are traders, men who keep shop and who have ventures upon the seas, and often make voyages themselves. Sindbad might easily have heard many of his own adventures from the lips of the motley crowd that gathered on the quays at Mizar from all parts of the known world. Ibn Sa'id stood and watched the shipping in 1246 and noticed the vessels arriving from all lands. Quote, "As for the merchandise from the Mediterranean and the Red Sea that comes to Mizr, it is past describing. Here is it bonded, not at Cairo, and hence it is distributed throughout Egypt." End of quote. What was true of Mizr and Mox was also true of their successor, the 14th century port at Balak. It was from Balak that Ali of Cairo, after spending all his inheritance making merry with his wife on the island of Rhoda, took ship for Damietta and set forth on his quest of a new fortune. The constantly recurring references to commercial voyages and great profits are exactly what would occur to a people whose wealth was made not only by a prodigiously fertile soil, but by a copious foreign trade. What the transit trade of Egypt was worth in Mamluk times may be judged from a few facts. A single vessel clearing cargo at Alexandria paid £21,000 in customs. The great Italian republics found it necessary to maintain consular agents in Egypt, and that there was a wealthy colony of European merchants is shown by their being able, headed by the consul of Venice, to guarantee the king of Cyprus's ransom of £100,000. The Venetians had enjoyed special privileges in Egypt since the time of El Adil in 1208, who allowed them to build a mart, funduc, of their own at Alexandria. The Pisans had a consul there, and the concessions to Venice were renewed in 1238. On the other side, in the Red Sea, there were the ports of Suez, Tor, Qusair, Aid, Hab, Delek, and Sawakin, where the Mamluk sultans levied customs of a tenth ad valorem. The Indian trade had greatly developed under the later Mamluk sultans, and there was much rivalry and a tariff war between the Arabian and Egyptian ports in the Red Sea, in the effort to secure the heavy customs dues, which were pressed beyond the customary tenth. In 1426 we read of 40 vessels from India and Persia paying £36,000 in duties at Gidda, the port of Mecca, which, like Yenbu, was then Egyptian. Nor were the government duties limited to importation. There were certain monopolies. Sugar, pepper, wood, metalwork could be sold only at government warehouses, at government prices, subject to duty. A consignment of pepper that was bought at Cairo for 50 dinars was sold to Europeans at Alexandria for 130 under government regulations. The Venetians, after vain consular remonstrance, sent a fleet to Alexandria to bring away all their merchants, and Bars Bey was obliged to reduce his exorbitant terms. How much store the Circassian sultans set by the transit trade between India and Europe has been seen in the vigorous effort made by El Guri to crush the Portuguese in the Arabian Sea as soon as he realized the dangerous rivalry of the Cape route. Indeed, the transit trade must have been a chief source of wealth. As Mr. Cameron, our consul at Port Said, has well put it, the Mamluk sultans, quote, masters of both Egypt and Syria, held the ports and caravan routes between Europe and her Indian trade, and levied customs dues on every bale of Oriental produce which arrived from the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea for transfer to the harbors between Alexandria and Alexandretta, and for transshipment to Venice. Until the discovery of the Cape route in 1498 and its subsequent development, they enjoyed the monopoly of the entire volume of Indian trade with the Levant, and Venice, by her commercial capitulations with them, was their sole agent on the continent. Let us try and estimate what this monopoly meant. An Arab merchant like Sinbad the sailor buys £10,000 worth of raw silks, nutmegs, pepper, indigo, cloves, and mace in Persia or at Calicut, and lands them at Basra or Suez. The sea route up the Persian Gulf would be shorter than the voyage up the Red Sea, but the caravan rode from Basra to Aleppo would be more perilous than the short journey across Egypt. At landing, the customs would amount to some £4,000. This is much above the mark, and the goods would then be worth, say, £20,000. A second Arab merchant on the Mediterranean coast, or perhaps at the wharves of Balak, would sell the consignment for £30,000 to the Venetian, who would have to pay another £5,000 customs dues before he could clear his cargo. Thus, whether in customs or in tolls, or in presents to local governors and escorts, a quarter of the £35,000 paid by the Venetian would go to the Mamluk Sultan and aristocracy merely for the privilege of transit. End of quote. It was not the government alone that made the profit. The Cairo merchant who brought the precious bales from India and the Spice Islands, or at least bought them from the Indian traders at the Red Sea ports, made his fortune too. The 1,001 Nights are full of such successful ventures. Did not the second sheikh, who led the two black hounds, describe how, quote, "We then prepared merchandise and hired a ship and embarked our goods and proceeded on our voyage for the space of a whole month, at the end of which we arrived at a city where we sold our merchandise, and for every piece of gold we gained 10. End of quote. Such fortunate speculations were, no doubt, of everyday occurrence, and the trade represented by these ventures did not all go out of the capital. A large part found its way into the bazaars, to be retailed to the good people of Cairo, and to minister to the luxurious tastes of the thousands of hangers-on to the Mamluk court. We can form but a meagre notion of the medieval funduk from the present bazaars. A funduk or khan or wakala, there is little difference between the three terms, is a great collection of warehouses and shops, generally surrounding a court, but sometimes more like a covered arcade, where the merchants keep their reserves of stores, and where the traders find lodgings for themselves and stabling for their beasts between their journeys. One great medieval khan is still familiar to every tourist, the Khan el Khalili, or Turkish Bazaar, built by Garkas el Khalili, the master of the horse of Sultan Barkuk, in 1400 on the site once occupied by the graves of the Fatimid caliphs, whose bones were dug up and carted away on asses to the rubbish mounds outside the eastern gate. Another khan, the Hamzawi, or cloth market, is also well known, and two of Kaibe's wakalas, the facades of which are finely ornamented with arabesque panels and intricate geometrical designs, and wooden medallions carved with the Sultan's name, still remain beside the Azhar and in the Surugaya. When Lane described Cairo in 1835, there were about 200 wakalas, and even now one can scarcely pass down a street without finding one of these big courts surrounded by rooms, the Inn of the East opening out through a tall gateway. In the 15th century, the khans of Cairo were busy marts of the merchants, and the Mamluk emirs, who had clear ideas as to the value of house property, emulated one another in building handsome wakalas, every room of which might be expected to bring in a substantial rent. There was the Khan of Mesrur, one of the most famous, the young man in the story of the humpback, quote, put up, end of quote, there, and stored his merchandise, and after a night's rest took some of his goods and went to the, quote, Caesarea of Garkas, end of quote, another famous market of medieval Cairo, dating from Fatimid days, to sell to the merchants. Quote, do as other merchants, end of quote, said the sheikh of the brokers to the stranger. Quote, sell thy merchandise upon credit for a certain period, employing a scrivener, a witness, and a money changer, and receive a portion of the profits every Thursday and Monday. So shalt thou make of every piece of silver too. Besides, thou wilt have leisure to enjoy the amusements of Egypt and its Nile. End of quote. So the young man followed his advice, and left his goods to be sold for him, whilst he lived joyously at the Khan of Mesrur, breakfasted on wine and chicken and mutton and sweetmeats, and perfumed himself elegantly, till he met the damsel at the shop of Bedr ed Din, the gardener, and there happened what fate had decreed to be a warning to such as would be admonished. That the young man should have his hand cut off by the executioner at the gate of Zuwaylah was exactly what might be expected in the days of the Mamluks. This Khan of Mesrur, or rather two Khans, one large and the other small, was built on a part of the site of the Fatimid great palace, where the slaves used to be sold by Mesrur, a favorite slave of Saladin, who left it as a legacy for the benefit of the poor. The larger building had 100 rooms, and was the chief resort of merchants from Syria, quote, the most renowned and greatest of the Khans, end of quote, says the topographer, but its prosperity declined after the tribulation of Syria at the hands of Tamerlane. Quote, its honor departed, and many of its apartments were ruined. End of quote. Another famous Khan was that of Bilal, a slave of Salih, the grandnephew of Saladin, so favored that the Sultan Kalan used to say, quote, God have mercy on our late master Salih. I used to carry the slippers of this eunuch Bilal whilst he went into the presence. End of quote. The slave was very rich and abounded in good deeds. Many poets praised him and were amply rewarded, and among his worthy acts was the building of the Khan, where the merchants would deposit their chests of great value. Quote, I used to enter this fundak, says Makrizi, and lo, around it were chests piled little and great, so that only a small space was left in the middle, and these chests contained gold and silver enough to amaze one. End of quote. Then there was the Khan of the Sebel, outside the Bab el-Fatah, founded by Saladin's vizier, Karakush, for, quote, sons of the road, end of quote, poor wayfarers who were received without payment, and the Wakala Kusan, built by Nasir's son-in-law, near the mosque of El-Hakim, where Syrian merchants stored oil and sesame and soap and preserves and pistachio nut, almond syrups, and the like, every storeroom being let by the emir's order at no more than 5 dirhams of silver, without extortion, and no one being turned away. It was a busy place in Makrizi's time, very popular on account of its cheapness, full of people and bales of goods, and noisy with the shouts of the porters. There were 360 lodgings above the storerooms, all occupied, and 4,000 people lived there. The Tatar devastation of Syria ruined this Khan too. Opposite the Zuwaylah gate stood the fruit market, where the produce of the gardens round Cairo was sold. It was roofed over, like most of the bazaars in former days, to keep off the rays of the sun, and the fruit, which smelt like the gardens of paradise, was tastefully arranged and decorated with flowers and sweet herbs. There were many more great buildings of this kind, the history of which is related by the laborious topographer, whose descriptions enable us almost to reconstruct in imagination the city of the 15th century. Cairo was a sumptuous and beautiful place in those days. The old Mamluk palaces, of which we have but relics in the huge blank walls of Beshtak's palace, the fine gateway of Yeshbek's Dar next to Sultan Hassan's mosque, and the better preserved mansions of Kayet Bey and of the Emir Mameh, known as the Bet el Kadi, were then in their full glory. The various quarters were still separated by their strong gates barred at night. The sucks were shaded by matting or wooden roofs, and the lattice windows with their delicate tracery overhung the streets. Makrizi enumerates and describes 37 haras, or quarters, 30 districts, Kut, 65 streets, Darb, 21 by-streets and alleys, Sikak and Kalka, 49 squares or places, Rabba, 50 markets, Sak, 23 great markets, Kaysaraya, 11 hostelries, Khan, Fundak, Wakala, 55 famous palaces and mansions, Qasr, Dar, 44 public baths, Haman, 28 closes and gardens, Hakar, Bastan, 11 race courses, Maidan, and numerous pleasure houses or belvederes, Manzara. Many of the streets still run in their old places, and some of their names survive, such as the Saliba or Crossways, Ben el Kasrain, Ben es Surain, Harat, Bargawan, Suk es Salah, Khan el Khalili, Darb el Asfar, Habanaya, Kurunfish. The old quarters of Cairo have changed much less than the old parts of London, but the reason is melancholy. London has changed because it has grown. Cairo remained comparatively unaltered because it was slowly decaying. The loss of much of the Indian trade, the dependence upon Turkey, the misrule of pashas and Mamluk beys, all tended to reduce the prosperity of the city, which had flourished exceedingly under the Turkish and Circassian sultans. End of section 16. Chapter 8, The City of the Arabian Nights, Part 1. Section 17 of the Story of Cairo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Cairo by Stanley Lane-Poole. Section 17, Chapter 8, The City of the Arabian Nights, Part 2. With decline of trade came decline in the arts. There is still a little good work made in Cairo in brass chasing, jewelry, and silk weaving, but it is a poor relic of what once went on there. One has only to visit the Arab Museum to realize what magnificent work the artists of Cairo produced in the Mamluk period. The arts were closely related to the mosques, which attained their greatest perfection of ornament in the same period, and the chief objects in the museum were once parts of the decoration or furniture of the mosques. The beautiful inlaid and chased silver and brass tables with delicate designs in open tracery, Koran cases, lamps and chandeliers, bowls, censers, candlesticks, enameled glass lamps with inscriptions in blue, picked out with carmine and gold, generally came from mosques and center round the 14th century. The carved panels, inlaid with ivory and ebony and choice woods, once enriched the doors and pulpits of the mosques, and the cast bronze bosses and cut brass filigree work belong chiefly to the same period. There are many admirable examples of these arts in the South Kensington Museum, and the British Museum possesses an unsurpassed collection of Saracenic metal work. There is unhappily no market of the inlayers now at Cairo as there was in Makrizi's time. This silver and gold inlay of arabesques and inscriptions on a brass base was one of the most elaborate and characteristic of Saracenic arts. It was not Egyptian in origin, but derived from the old Sasanian silversmiths of Mesopotamia. The oldest specimens we know came from Mosul on the Tigris, which was a famous home of metal workers within reach of the mines of the Taurus country. No doubt these Mosul smiths were attracted to Cairo in the flourishing days of the Mamluk sultans or even earlier. At least it is certain that some of their finest work was done for the Egyptian market and even bears the names of well-known Cairene rulers and emirs. There is the casket, for example, engraved with the name and titles of El Adil II, Saladin's grandnephew, who sat on the throne of Egypt from 1238 to 1240 and was succeeded by Salih, the husband of Spray of Pearls. It is in the Mosul style of the earliest period. The sides are ornamented with dotted 8 foils, exactly resembling the ornament on the silver coins of the family of Saladin, containing hunting scenes, a combat with a lion, a horseman with falcon on wrist, which is covered with the falconer's glove, etc. The intervening ground is decorated with fine arabesques, and an inscription on the bevel of the lid gives the name and titles of the Sultan. On the top are personifications of the 6 planets of Arabian science surrounding the sun, the 7th, the moon, a seated figure holding a crescent, Mercury with his writing materials, Venus, a woman playing on the lyre, Mars, a warrior brandishing a sword and holding a bleeding head, Jupiter, a throned judge, and Saturn, patron of thieves, with his bludgeon and purse. Outside these is a band of the 12 signs of the zodiac, represented much in the usual manner. On the bottom of the box is an inscription stating that it was made, quote, for the royal wardrobe of El Adil, end of quote. The hunting scenes and representations of human figures and animals are characteristic of Mesopotamian silver work, and we see medallions of 2-headed eagles on a splendid inlaid perfume burner in the British Museum. Made, as the silver letters inform us, quote, by order of His Excellency, the generous, the exalted Lord, the great Emir, the honorable Master Marshal, warrior for the faith, warden of Islam, mighty heaven supported, victorious, full moon of the faith, Bey Sari, Mamluk of Ez Zahir, Baybars, end of quote, etc. The date must be before 1279, and the vessel carries us back to the days of Kalan and the beginning of Mamluk splendor. Bey Sari was one of the greatest and most sumptuous of the early Mamluk emirs, and his perfume burner was typical of the luxurious refinements of his palace. He valued his comfort more than ambition, and twice refused the precarious honor of the throne during the unsettled period succeeding Kalan's death, when the sultanate was open to the strongest emir. Even so, he could not escape the consequences of being wealthy and distinguished, and in spite of his retiring character he was suspected of pretensions to power, fleeced of his treasures, and often confined to the dungeons of the citadel. His palace, which stood in Bain el Kasrain, covered 4 acres and possessed the richest mosaics and the handsomest carved doors in Cairo. Bedr ed-Din Bey Sari was indeed the most sumptuous man of his time. He loved to surround himself with beautiful things, and his slave bodyguard was the best appointed of the day. No fortune could support his lavish extravagance. He not only spent upon himself, but gave prodigally to all who asked him. Hospitality was his foible, and his gifts to the poor ran in round sums of 500 or 1,000 dirhams, say francs, to each applicant. He would daily distribute 3,000 pounds of meat, and a single present consisted of 1,000 pieces of gold, 5,000 bushels of corn, and 1,000 hundredweight of honey. One of his Mamluks used every day to draw 90 pounds of meat and 70 rations of barley, which it is to be presumed neither he nor his horses could possibly digest. Naturally, Bey Sari was perpetually in debt. The constant amount of his liabilities was placed at 400,000 dirhams, for as soon as one debt was paid off, the generous soul hastened to contract another of the same figure. A considerable part of his expenditure must have gone in table equipage, for it is recorded that he never drank twice out of the same cup, and as Macreasy mentions, that at one time this 13th century epicure was wholly given over to wine and hazard. The number of cups required must have been considerable, but a great and cultivated emir needed more than cups for his comfort. He must have inlaid tables on which to put the broad brass tray, incrusted with chased silver and gold, which carried his service of the forbidden fruit of the grape. He must have his beautiful hall lighted by candles placed in elaborate stands, covered with silver inlay. His very tubs and cooking pots must be chased with arabesques and complicated designs, and his palace must be perfumed with incense rising from perfume burners, on which the artist had engraved representations of horsemen at the chase, hounds and quarry, falcons and waterfowl, and all the decorative subjects of the Saracen silversmith. The earliest and finest examples of metal work connected with the names of Cairo kings and nobles are of Mosul origin, though very probably made in Cairo in the market of the inlayers, by artists who had been attracted to the court. There was undoubtedly an early Fatimid art of a similar character, but beyond a very few rare examples, such as the Bayeux casket at Paris and some specimens of cut crystal at Venice, we know almost nothing of its style. Under the Mamluk sultans, however, Cairo soon acquired a school of her own, which seems to have possessed traditions coming from a different source than that of Mosul. The Cairo style is what we see on the numerous trays, bowls, cups, censers, and other vessels of the Mamluks of Egypt of the 14th and 15th centuries, preserved in our museums and private collections. Some points of resemblance to the Mosul work may be noticed, but the new elements are very distinct. The figures of horsemen and seated princes have for the most part disappeared, as it was natural they should when the Turkish princes became habituated to the puritanical prescriptions of Islam concerning the treatment of living things in art. But borders representing beasts of the chase and a ground covered with wild duck and other fowl still remain. The prevalence of the duck, which was easily explicable in the swamps of Mesopotamia, finds another raison d'être in Egypt, for the founder of the line of sultans who ruled in Cairo for nearly a century was a Turk of Kipchak, whose name, Kalan, means in his native Mongol tongue, duck. We may compare Abbot Islip's plastic puns on his own name in his chapel in Westminster Abbey. The ornament of the Mamluk metalwork is essentially different in style from that of Mosul. The inscriptions are arranged in broad bands with large surfaces of silver inlay, divided by medallions filled with the Sultan's name on a fess, or else by some heraldic coat of arms borne by the owner, among which the cup and polo stick, indicating the court offices of cupbearer and polo master, the lozenge, and a curious imitation of a hieroglyphic inscription common on the ancient monuments of Egypt, but doubtless unintelligible to the copyists, are the most usual. Round the medallions are belts of flowers and leaves, reminding one of the designs of Damascus tiles, and similar leaves and flowers interspersed with birds cover the ground. The execution is no less admirable than the design. There was no scamped work among these Saracen smiths. They cut away the whole design in the brass, and undercut the edges to hold the thin plates of silver or gold to be hammered and burnished in, which formed the design, and they chased with the graver every plate of silver, were it only a pin's head in size, with wings, or eyes, or floral scrolls, a work of infinite labor, and then they covered the interstices, where the brass showed with a black bituminous composition which set off the precious metal to advantage. Much of the silver and coating has been lost by wear and time, and it is difficult to realize the beauty of the original state of most of the vessels and trays that have come down to us, but a careful examination only reveals more fully the exquisite skill, care, and fine, honest workmanship that no time or injury can destroy. This art of silver inlay, like architecture in wood and ivory carving, and every other variety of aesthetic expression, culminated in the wonderful efflorescence of art and culture in the reign of Nasir, Kalan's son, in the first half of the 14th century. Whenever in any museum we see a fine specimen of metalwork, we may be almost sure to find the name of a Nasiri emir, that is, a courtier or mamluk of Nasir. in its inscription and sometimes even the name of the Sultan himself. The topographer tells us that in his day, in the early part of the 15th century, this beautiful art had fallen into disrepute. It used, he says, to be a favorite taste, and, quote, we have seen inlaid work kept in such quantities that it could not be counted. There was hardly a house in Cairo or Mizr that had not many pieces of inlaid copper. End of quote. He means brass. A stand of inlaid bowls and plates ranged on a frame of carved wood and ivory was a usual part of a bride's trousseau and cost as much as 200 dinars. But he adds, quote, the art is now lacking in Mizr. The demand for this inlaid copper work has fallen off in our times, and since many years the people have turned away from buying what was to be sold of it, so that but a small remnant of the workers of inlay subsists in this market. End of quote. The art was not dead, however. It had merely passed on elsewhere. The heritage which Cairo received from Mosul was bequeathed to Venice. We have seen that the Venetians were the European agents of the Egyptian merchants, and it is not too much to say that Venice was half an Oriental city. Italy was full of Eastern influences. We know that a 12th century poet lamented that Pisa was, quote, delivered over to Moors, Indians, and Turks, end of quote. That there was a Via Saracena at Ferrara, and Lucera was deeply tinged with Muslim traditions dating from Frederick II's importation of Saracen archers. But Venice felt this influence most of all. Her commerce and colonies brought her merchants into relations with the artistic work of the East. Her ambassadors brought home the splendid gifts of the Mamluk sultans, and she soon began to import the artist as well as the art. The opus Salomonis, or Jew's work, was the name given to the Saracenic style, often referred to in early romances. Chaucer had heard of it, for he writes in Sertopus, quote, and over that a fine hauberk was all ywrought of Jew's work. End of quote. Especially did Venice excel in the chasing of great salvers in the Saracenic manner, though with considerable differences both in design and in technique. The silver is applied chiefly in narrow threads instead of broad plates, and the designs are chiefly arabesque, whilst the forms of the vessels show marked improvement upon the somewhat crude outlines of the Cairo silversmith. Native Italian artists began to copy the art introduced by Mahmud the Kurd and his Saracen comrades. They called themselves Azamin, that is, workers in the Persian style, al-Ajamina, for it has long been the fashion to miscall every form of Saracenic art Persian, and we read of Italian artists such as Giorgio Ghizzi Azimina of Mantua and Paulus Ageminius, who excelled in the art which had been imported from Egypt. We've singled out the silver inlay from among the arts of medieval Cairo because it is a branch in which the development can be traced with certainty by a series of dated examples. But the chief decorative arts of the mosque builders were wood carving and marble mosaic. The beautiful paneled work of mosque pulpits and doors, originally suggested, no doubt, by the necessity of small surfaces in a hot climate where warping had to be prevented, are among the most characteristic forms of Cairo ornament, and the use of variegated marbles in the mihrabs of the mosques produces a rich, if sometimes rather glaring, effect which was imitated in the dados of the house of the nobles, now unhappily for the most part destroyed. The extensive use of wood in Cairo architecture is the more remarkable when it is considered how little suitable wood grows in Egypt. On the other hand, the dry climate, though it warps, preserves timber for centuries. The original wooden ties of the pillars of Ibn Tulun's mosque have stood for more than 1,000 years and are still sound, and a portion even of the ceiling of the arcades has been preserved. This wooden ceiling shows that in the 9th century the same method was used as is seen in all periods of Saracenic art previous to the introduction of European styles. It consists of joists of palm trunks sawn in two, with the 3 exposed sides faced with planks to square the outline. The hollows between the squared joists were divided by cross pieces into shallow compartments or coffers. In private houses the joists were often left uncovered in their natural half-round shape, whether planked or left in the round. The joists and the coffers between were coated with plaster, generally laid on canvas, and the plaster was painted with arabesques in deep blue, carmine, and gold. These coffered ceilings, which may still be seen in many houses, have a wonderfully rich effect with their deep tones of red and blue, lighted up by gold outlines, and the transition from the ceiling to the walls is skilfully masked by arching and stalactite pendentives richly painted with similar designs. Inferior to the coffered ceilings, but still very effective, are those composed of boards nailed flat across the joists and covered with a thin coating of stucco, worked into arabesque and floral patterns, and then painted and gilt, or with a geometrical design formed by applique strips of wood, gilt, shaded with red, the interstices being filled with arabesques and painted stucco. Wood carving had ample opportunities for display in the pulpits, Quran desks, interior doors, and cupboards of mosques. Some of the oldest examples from the mosques of Ibn Tulun and El Hakim may be seen in the Arab Museum at Cairo, and the deep volutes carved in the panels are clearly of Byzantine origin, resembling the still earlier but undated panels found in the tract of Ain es Sira, south of Cairo. In the 13th century the style alters. Instead of the bold foliate designs, we find more intricate and delicate ornament distributed in much smaller geometrical panels. A peculiarly beautiful example is the Sheikh's tomb casing of 1216, of which one side is in the museum at South Kensington and the other three in the Arab Museum. Another is the carved casing of the tomb of S. Salih Ayeb, 1249. Quote, the little panels are formed into hexagonal stars and delicately carved, and here appears the representation of fruit stalks, which is a common feature in 13th century wood carving. The mihrab, or prayer niche, from the chapel of Sayyida Rakaya, which belongs probably to the same century, deserves special notice for its characteristic ornamentation of stems branching out of a vase. End of quote. But it was under the Mamluk sultans, and especially in the great period of An-Nasir, that wood carving attained its most exquisite development. Woods of different colors were employed to produce the effect of relief, and inlay was largely adopted in place of carving in the solid block. Sometimes each little carved panel was set in a frame of ebony beading, which was itself carved, and often consisted of two or three distinct frames, one outside the other, whilst the central design was hardly ever the same in two panels out of many hundreds. The amount of careful work demanded in carving and putting together a large surface of this intricate paneling must have been immense. Many beautiful examples may be seen in the mosques, and even finer are the carved doors in wood and ivory paneling in the Coptic churches of Babylon, from which there can be little doubt that the Muslims learnt the art. But to see Mamluk carving at its best, one need not leave London. A large number of the very finest specimens were taken away from their lawful guardians during the reign of the Khedive Ismail, and even earlier have found their way to the museum at South Kensington. There we may study at leisure some of the rich, yet not over-elaborate, arabesque carvings abstracted from the pulpit set up in the mosque of Ibn Tulun by Lagan in 1296. Others of extraordinary beauty from the mosque of El Maradani, 1339, absurdly set in the top of a French table. Others probably from the pulpit of the mosque of Kusan, also set in coarse modern framework, but preserving all the delicate grace of the arabesque carvings absolutely intact. And finally the complete pulpit bearing the inscription of Kayet Bey, but from what mosque is not known. The whole forms a singularly rich and beautiful exhibition of Saracenic wood carving of the best period. There are differences and even decadence in the series, however, and a careful study of the designs will show that the art reached its highest point in the carvings of El Maradani, that is, immediately after the reign of En Nasir. Sheikhu's pulpit of 1358 is not so good. Sultan Hassan's is of stone. El Riyad's of 1420 is distinctly inferior, and even Kayet Bey's prince, though he was of Cairo builders, is not to be compared with the work of the middle of the 14th century. The designs have become less spontaneous, the lines are harder and more mechanical, and as in stone carving, there is a tendency to repetition utterly foreign to the earlier work. Part of this may be explained by the introduction of ivory as the material for the inlaid panels, for ivory, though capable of even more delicate carving, is less easy to work in flowing lines. But the main cause was probably the preponderating attention given to carving in stone. No sooner does stone become the predominant material for decoration than wood carving, like stucco tooling, falls into comparative neglect. The middle of the 14th century was the parting of the ways. Stone became the favorite material, and the carvers of wood, if they did not lay aside the graver for the stone chisel, at least molded their style upon the harder outlines of the sculptors, and the result was deterioration. If wood carving decayed after the middle of the 14th century, another branch of woodwork was notably developed. One charming feature of the exterior of a Cairo house is the meshrabaya of delicate turned tracery. There is no reason to doubt that this kind of work is very old, but whether by reason of its fragility or the frequent conflagrations that afflicted the city, no ancient examples have been preserved. The few wooden lattices that still remain in the older mosques are of quite a different style. They are made of stout, clumsy quarterings, divided into compartments filled by square or round upright balusters, such as are seen in the tomb of Calan. Others are mere grills of large open squares with no pretension to artistic design. A finer kind is seen in Lagin's pulpit in the Mosque of Ibn Tulun, 1296, where the mesh is close and the knobs are inlaid and carved. It is curious that the true meshrabaya, with its varied designs and lace-like effect, first appears in the screen of the sanctuary in the Mosque of El Maradani, which also shows the highest development of wood carving. As the one art decayed, the other improved. There are fine examples of meshrabaya work of the early part of the 15th century, as in the pulpit of El Mayyad, but it attained its greatest perfection in the age of Kayet Bey, of which a fine specimen is preserved in the pulpit of Abu Bekr ibn Muzir. Most of the house meshrabayas are comparatively modern, though it is impossible to fix their precise date. Their inevitable disappearance is an aesthetic loss that nothing can replace, but it must be admitted that they form the most dangerous conductors of fire from house to house and street to street that the ingenuity of man could well devise. There is this to be said about every branch of artistic work of medieval Cairo, whether it be architecture, carving in wood or stone, metal, chasing, or glass, it is always distinctively original. The Saracens brought no art with them. Indeed, they appear to have been singularly lacking in the aesthetic sense. They learned their arts from their foreign subjects, yet they invariably introduced an element of differentiation which marks their work as characteristically Saracenic. They learned their metal chasing from Persia, but they soon made it their own. They copied Byzantine and Coptic wood carving and added the essential personal equation which constitutes a distinct art. They found glass making and blowing in Egypt, acquired the secrets of enameling and gilding from Constantinople, and then produced a style of enameled lamps totally unlike any other in the world. It is not only a variation in design or shape that makes the difference. The whole character of the work in every branch of Saracenic art is distinct and absolutely sui generis. They were not only wonderful assimilators, they also had the genius of development on original lines. Perhaps the strangest part of the matter is that the highest development was achieved in the troubled times of singularly uncultivated and sanguinary foreign masters. Yet the age of the Mamluk sultans was the Saturnian age of Mohammedan Egypt in art and also in literature, for it must not be forgotten that some of the greatest names in Muslim theology, jurisprudence, criticism, and history were associated as qadis or professors with the mosques and medriyas of Cairo, and that the Mamluk period produced or encouraged such writers as Ibn Khaldun, Nawawi, Ibn Dukmak, Makrizi, Ibn Hajar el-Aini, Ibn Arab Shah, Abu el-Mahasin, as-Suyuti, and Ibn Ayas, who either were born in Egypt or, like Abu el-Fida, spent many years in Cairo. The 15th century was perhaps the most prolific period in Egyptian literature, and this activity was more than rivaled in the neighboring province of Syria under the same sultans. End of section 17. Section 18 of the story of Cairo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Cairo by Stanley Lane-Poole. Section 18. Chapter 9. Beys and Pashas, Part 1. No one has had the heart to write the history of Egypt during the 3 centuries of its subjection to the sultans of Turkey, from its conquest by Selim the Grim in 1516 to Muhammad Ali's foundation of a virtually independent dynasty in 1805. The annals of this period are monotonous, and the great figures of the earlier Mamluk period are wanting. The whole action seems to be played upon a smaller stage by inferior performers. The incentives to public spirit supplied by foreign wars were withdrawn from a merely provincial government, and the profuse expenditure and sumptuous luxury of a sovereign court no longer stimulated art and handicrafts or quickened the emulation of the emirs. The cramping influence of dependence and the grasping physical policy of the Ottoman Empire destroyed much of the old magnificence of the Mamluks. Yet there was no such vivid contrast between Cairo under the Pashas and the city that Makrizi describes as has sometimes been imagined. Everything in the East changes by almost imperceptible degrees, and the mills of God in Egypt grind with the tedious slowness of the creaking sakkayas of the country. Deterioration there was, but it came very gradually. The emirs were still the dominant power, and the chief difference was that instead of a sultan elected by themselves, they had over them a pasha appointed by the Sublime Porte. The pasha's authority was checked by a council of Mamluk emirs, or beys as they came to be called, and he was frequently deposed by them or by the intrigues of the mutinous soldiery. Though a pasha might arrive with a suite of 1,200 persons and scatter handkerchiefs full of gold coins on festal occasions, he could seldom make head against the military oligarchy. The chief Mamluk, or Sheikh el-Beled, mayor of the city, as he was entitled, was a far more powerful personage than the pasha. The emirs were much what they had been under the Circassian dynasty. They were not the same men, because Selim had massacred as many as he could catch, but they were similar: Turks, Georgians, Circassians, risen from slavery to office and rank. And they maintained great state in their palaces beside the Azbekaya lake, or on the Birket el Fil in the Crossway, or the Street of Arms, were followed by large bands of retainers, and carried on their jealousies, civil wars, and street fights with as much fervor as before. A new element of discord was introduced by the Turkish battalions of Azabs and Janizaries in the citadel barracks, and the commanders of these troops became the most powerful emirs in Egypt. But these too were of precisely the same character as the earlier Mamluks, and save for the absence of a controlling influence such as a strong sultan sometimes exerted, but a delegated pasha almost never, there was little to choose between the state of Cairo under the new regime and its anarchic condition under the impotent direction of most of the later Circassian kings. Egypt, in fact, was still ruled by Mamluks. Its pashas were perpetually changed and lived in terror of their own garrison. The emirs held the real power and used it in the old way for their own benefit and for the ruin by exile or execution of their rivals. They formed themselves into powerful cliques, such as the Casimis and the Fakaris, and their retainers fought each other in the streets and besieged the government Azab troops for months together. They had already discovered that the citadel could be commanded by artillery on the hill behind. We read in Gabarty's chronicle of bands of troops fortifying themselves in the mosques of Ibn Tulun, Almas, Muhammadiyah, and so forth, and discharging cannonballs from the adjacent minarets. The anarchy at times was indescribable. Streets were deserted, houses plundered, and no man dared to go as far as Bullock or Old Miser. Then followed an interval of tranquillity assured by the temporary supremacy of some great lord. It is difficult to discover any very notable distinction between these later emirs and those of the golden age of Mamluk civilization. Their opportunities were less because they could no longer carry on wars in Syria or Asia Minor in their own behoof, for the contingents that were constantly drafted in Egypt for foreign service were merely employed as an insignificant part of the Ottoman armies. But their characters, occupations, and tastes appear to have been much what they had been for the preceding 2 centuries. There was a difference in degree, but not in kind. They were not, as a rule, such big men with large opportunities as their forerunners, but in race, in character, and action, they were the same. Indeed, some of them were remarkable personages fit to compare with those of the old school. Othman Bey du el Fakar, for example, in the first half of the 18th century, after playing a bold part in the faction fight that centered round his patron Du el Fakar Bey and Turks Bey, and seeing 11 emirs of rank done to death in the palace of the Defterdar, himself narrowly escaping with a saber cut in his turban, became the most eminent noble in Cairo, with power to raise his own Mamluks to the rank of emir. He was chief of the pilgrimage Emir el Hag, one of the most coveted posts in Egypt in 1739, and when Ali el Gelfi, the deputy, footnote, by deputy is meant the Ketkuda, commonly pronounced Kiyaya, or in Egypt Kikaya, who was the deputy of the Pasha, and often corresponded loosely with what we should call Minister of the Interior or Home Secretary. End of footnote. Was assassinated. Othman Bey deposed the Pasha and appointed Rud Wan to be deputy over the Azab battalions. Othman was the first emir who ventured to invite the Pasha of Egypt to a feast in his palace, and the other nobles were completely subject to him. He held a court in his own house to decide causes of complaint, and incorruptible himself, he severely punished any cases of extortion or oppression that came before him, watched the market inspector closely, prescribed a fixed tariff for bread and other necessaries of life, and insisted on the due payment of pious benefactions to their proper uses. Lofty in character, of noble ideas and thoughts, just, able, disinterested, of honest life, and proud as Lucifer, he left such an impression behind him when the intrigues of his rivals banished him from Egypt, that he created an era. One heard people say, quote, such a thing happened so many years after the departure of Othman Bey, end of quote, or, quote, I was such and such an age when Othman Bey left, end of quote. Rudwan el Gelfi, just referred to, was another notable figure of the 18th century. Whilst he and another deputy, Ibrahim, held office, the country enjoyed absolute peace. Food was cheaper than was ever known before, and plenty reigned in all classes. In those days every great man kept open house twice a day, noon and evening, in a spacious hall to which all might enter. The lord and his guests sat at the head of the table, and his Mamluks and followers lower down, as it were, quote, below the salt, end of quote, and it was held disgraceful to refuse admission to any stranger who presented himself. On feast days great dishes of rice and honey or milk were distributed to the poor, and sweetmeats were served on Fridays and festivals. One of Rudwan's houses was on the Azbekaya on the border of the lake, as it then was at least at high Nile. Its halls were surmounted by cunningly designed domes in which gold arabesques on a blue ground harmonized with stained glass of many colors in charming combination. He built kiosks in a garden beside the canal, where he had laid out a lake and cascade, and there, when his ambition was satisfied, he took his pleasure, which savored, it must be confessed, of debauch. Indeed, Rudwan was no stern moralist, like Othman Bey, but allowed a considerable license to the fair ladies of Cairo. The police had his orders not to disturb them or balk their admirers. And, Cairo then resembled a land of gazelles, a paradise of houris and darlings. Its inhabitants drank their fill in the cup of delight, as though there were no reckoning to be paid on the day of judgment. End of quote. No wonder that poets sang his praises in such verses as "the empurpled wine," end of quote, and "the perfume of paradise," end of quote. Rudwan's palace is no more to be seen in the Ezbekaya, but his gate, the Bab el Azab, leading into the citadel from the Rumaila, preserves his memory. His end was tragic. Conspirators surrounded his house in the street of Kusan, and bullets began to pour in whilst he was engaged in the meditative process of having his head shaved. He fought while he had strength, and then with a broken leg struggled on horseback and fled to die in Upper Egypt. He was the last great commander of the Azabs. It was not only the emirs who owned such splendid houses as Rudwan. Another house on the Ezbekaya belonged to a famous merchant, Ahmad Esh Sharibi, the apothecary whose family had produced emirs and owned mamluks. They possessed immense wealth, and they used it as high-minded, honest gentlefolk. Learned men frequented their house, which was full of rare manuscripts as well as ordinary works of reference. Whatever book was in the market, if it was not in their library, they bought it regardless of the price, and once there it was immediately placed at the disposal of every visitor. A scholar was sure to find any book he required in the Sharibi library, and he was at liberty to carry it off on loan or even to keep it altogether, for the princely merchants would never think of asking its return, but would merely seek out and buy another copy. From the scholar's point of view, it seems impossible to improve upon this system. The members of this family were more than enlightened book collectors and book lenders. They were strict observers of the austere rule of the Malikis, tenacious of sound morals, and exclusive in their connections. They married only among their own large family circle, and their daughters never left the house except when they were married or borne to their grave. It was well to be cautious in days when the luxurious Rudwan was encouraging amatory adventures, and when a party of high-born dames, riding out to smell the air, as Cairo ladies do now at the proper season, were set upon near the Ezbekaya and stripped of their jewels and every garment they had on. But the Sharibi folk, though strict, could unbend. When marriage feasts were afoot, for example, they gave splendid entertainments, but so careful were they of their daughters that they waited till all the guests were safely engaged in prayer at the mosque of Ezbek. Footnote pulled down in 1869. It was built by the famous emir Ezbek ibn Tutash, from whom the Ezbekaya took its name. End of footnote. Opposite the house, and then hurried the bride off to her husband's abode under guard of a discreet body of matrons, after which there was plenty of gun firing and torch waving, and all was merry. The family had the custom of appointing one of their number trustee of all their property and business. It was his duty to collect the rents, gather the harvest and crops, receive the profits of their ventures, and pay all expenses, including the family's dress and pocket money. At the end of the year he drew up in his balance sheet and paid each member his share. This excellent plan was not likely to last forever, and one is not surprised to learn that at last the younger members quarreled over the accounts, and the joint stock company broke up in disorder. This was no doubt an exceptional family, but there were many of the kind, and there are some yet in Cairo, sterling, honest folk who walk in the old paths and guard a severe self-respect. The zeal for books displayed by this family casts an interesting light upon the education and learning of the times. During the earlier Mamluk days, many important libraries had been formed in Cairo, partly from the spoils of Syrian mosques, and if we are to take as evidence the long biographies of numerous sheikhs, professors, divines, historians, and poets, related with enthusiastic admiration by El-Gabarty. There was a vast deal of intellectual energy expended in Egypt in the 17th and 18th centuries, though perhaps it was hardly in the first rank of original genius. He reports a curious conversation, however, in 1750 between Ahmad Pasha, a governor of mathematical tastes, and the Sheikh Abdallah esh Shabrawi of the Azhar. The Pasha remarked that he had continually heard of the wonderful merits of Egypt as the home of learning, but he would like to see the results. Quote, "True, O my master," end of quote, replied the sheikh. Quote, "Egypt is, as you have heard, the mine of sciences and knowledge," end of quote. Quote, "But where are they?" End of quote, asked the Pasha. Quote, "As far as I could see, you know nothing but law and metaphysic and other less important studies, and disdain practical science altogether." End of quote. The sheikh had to admit that at the Azhar they did not teach mathematics beyond arithmetic, which was useful for the law of inheritance. Quote, "How about astronomy?" End of quote, suggested the Pasha. Quote, "It is needed for the hours of prayer, times of fast, and many other things." End of quote. The sheikh admitted that few studied astronomy, which demanded special aptitudes in instruments and physiological conditions, and a, quote, "sweet and tranquil disposition," end of quote, for its proper pursuit. But he said he could find the man whom the Pasha wanted, though not in the Azhar. When the man appeared, it seems his arithmetical problems delighted the governor, who gave him a fur cloak, which the sage afterwards sold for 800 dinars. He drew beautiful sundials on marble to show the hours of prayer, with the appropriate mottos, and two of these were set up in the Azhar and on the roof of the mosque of the Imam esh Shafi. Footnote. Monsieur von Berchem describes some curious sundials in his Notes d'Archéologie Arabe, 1892, 13-18. One was set up in the mosque of Ibn Tulun in 696, 1296 by Lagan. Another may still be seen in the mosque of Kusin, and is dated 785, 1383. A third exists in the tomb mosque of Inal, and bears the date 871, 1466. End of footnote. One gathers from this anecdote, as well as from the lists of works described by the historian, that study in Cairo at that time was rather zealous than profound, and that learning was decidedly in its decadence. Religion, on the other hand, was more powerful than ever. The annals of the Pashalik are full of references to the influence of the Azhar professors and of the Sayyids, and we hear of something very near a revolution when a Turkish preacher got up in the mosque of El Mayyad and fulminated against the invocation of saints, a popular accretion which is certainly no part of the creed of Muhammad. The preacher urged the crowd to demolish the cupolas over the saints' tombs, and the orthodox professors of divinity had much trouble to silence him and appease the crowd. There was often a very severe regulation of public behavior in deference to religious notions, and we find, for example, a stern prohibition of smoking in the streets. Police marched up and down 3 times a day, and if any smoker was caught, he had to eat his pipe bowl. An old custom mentioned by Nasir-e Khusro above page 109 was still in force. A man who had falsified documents was paraded on camelback through the streets, whilst a crier proclaimed, quote, "Behold the punishment of forgers," end of quote. The Cairenes were clearly very superstitious, and when in 1735 a circumstantial rumor went round that the resurrection would certainly take place on the next Friday, in 2 days' time, they bade each other last farewells and wandered about the fields and roads, saying goodbye to the land they loved, whilst the people of Giza, moved by a superstition which ran in their minds from ages long before Islam was discovered, bathed hysterically in the Nile, both men and women. There was nothing but panic and repentance and prayer till Saturday, when, behold, nothing had happened. An age that attached so much importance to religion was not likely to neglect its shrines. It is a mistake to ascribe the ruin of so many of the mosques of Cairo to the period of the Turkish pashas. On the contrary, the danger was that they might be, quote, "restored," end of quote, out of all knowledge. Cairo is full of, quote, "Turkish," end of quote, mosques, that is, Turkish of the Othmanli style, which, if they cannot compare with the buildings of the earlier Mamluks, are nevertheless very creditable examples of their kind, and far superior to anything built, say, in England during the past century. Indeed, the mosques of Sayyida Safaya, 1604, and of Muhammad Abu Dahab, 1774, are exceedingly noble buildings, and that little gem of Turkish mosaic work, El Burdani, is beautiful in its own way. The architects of the Ottoman period abandoned the madrasa style introduced by Saladin, which, as we have seen, had lost much of its original cruciform plan when the madrasas were used as congregational mosques under the Circassian Mamluks. But whilst reverting to the older and simpler plan of the Gami, they modified it by substituting cupolas of Byzantine form for the level ceilings which formerly covered the sanctuary. In fact, the Ottoman mosque is practically a basilica, a special feature of the mosques and restorations of the Othmanli period is the introduction of faience. The madrasa of Aksankar was restored by Ibrahim Aga in 1652, and the whole east wall covered with fine blue tiles, chiefly of the Damascus style, with a few so-called Rhodian, probably from Constantinople. It was not often that restoration proved so successful, and one has frequently to deplore the patching of Turkish additions upon the old masterpieces. Ahmad Pasha restored the then dilapidated mosque of El Mayyad in 1690. Another Pasha built the Arbain Mosque by the Kara Maiden Gate in 1704. Ahmad the Deputy restored the Fatimid Mosque of Ez Sabfir, known as El Fakahani, in 1735. But the prince of restorers was Abd Rahman Kid Huda, who enjoyed great influence before the time when Ali Bey, himself the restorer of the dome of the tomb mosque of Imam Shafi and builder of the Balak Bazaar, deposing the reigning pasha, made himself king of Egypt from 1768 to 1772. Abdur Rahman's father, Athman Ket Huda, had architectural tastes. Out of his very ill-gotten gains he built his mosque, school, and fountain by the Ezbekaya lake, and on the day of opening filled the great central basin and all the ewers he could collect with sherbet for their congregation. He also built a school for the blind at the Azhar and other benefactions. His son, however, far surpassed him. Every tourist knows his little Sibyl, elegant like its founder, who was dainty in person and dress and very fair, at the end of Bain el Kasrain, with its tiles and open arched school above. But this was the least of his works. He built a mosque outside of the Babel Futa, and another by the Babel Gurayib, with a cistern, fountain, and school, a great reservoir with fountain and school near the Ezbekaya cemetery for the Sakos or water carriers, rebuilt the chapels of Sayyida Zainab and Sayyida Sakina, and erected others near the Karafa gate, in the Musky, in the Hosnaya quarter, and in the Abdin street, etc. Of his restorations, the best known is that of the Azhar, which owes its present aspect largely to Abd Rashman's work. He put in 50 marble columns supporting groins of phase stone covered with costly woods, erected a new mihrab and pulpit, built the 2 archways, one with a school for orphans above it, and the other with a minaret, set up a tomb in the court, added libraries, reading rooms, kitchens, and other apartments for the benefit of students from Upper Egypt, enlarged the Tabar Saya and Akburgawaya madrasas attached to the Azhar, and built a splendid portal between them opposite the Wakala of Kate Bay, furnished rewalks or partitions for students from Mecca and from the Sudan, and settled rents and trust for the maintenance of these benefactions, besides giving every day in Ramadan to the Azhar kitchen a large quantity of rice, butter, oil, and meal for the evening refreshment of the students after the day's fast. Abd-ur-Rahman also restored the mosque of the Imam Shafi and paved the corridor with variegated marbles, repaired the tomb of Sayyida Nafisa and the Maristan of Kalan, then a madhouse, but after pulling down the dome he neglected to rebuild it and merely boarded it over, and so it remains to this day. He took great pains to trace the bequests left by the founder and his successors to the hospital, and succeeded in recovering the title deeds and restoring the revenues. By whatever means he acquired his wealth, and it was said the means were not above suspicion, there was no end to this man's charitable acts. At winter time he distributed woolen clothes to crowds of the blind, who always abound at Cairo, and also to the muezzins, to protect them from cold when chanting the nightly calls to prayer. The poor clamored about his door in the evenings of Ramadan, waiting for the plates of food which were never refused. After the meal they went away happy with 2 loaves and 2 pears ready for the next day's breakfast. Altogether, Abd Rahman Kaya built or rebuilt 18 mosques, besides chapels, fountains, schools, bridges, and every sort of edifice. He had an architectural passion, and fortunately excellent taste in its gratification, and the people well named him, quote, the great benefactor, end of quote. He died at Cairo in 1776 at a great age, after 12 years' exile in Arabia, for all his charity could not protect him from the suspicions of Ali Bey. All the ulema, professors, students, and poor of his numerous benefactions escorted his splendid funeral to the Azhar, where he lies in the tomb which he had built near the south gate. The last great mosque built during the period of the Pashalik was that of Muhammad Bey, known as Abu Dahab, or Father of Gold, or, quote, Father of Gold, end of quote, from his munificent way of scattering gold coins among the crowd. He was the favorite and trusted mamluk of the great Ali Bey, and he rewarded his patron by maneuvering his downfall and exile, and finally accomplishing his death. He was a brilliant soldier, fought successful campaigns in Arabia and Syria for his master, and achieved extraordinary popularity by his delightful manners and open hand. Egypt had peace whilst he held the reins of power, and the Sublime Porte, whilst appointing pashas as before, wisely left the real authority in the hands of the capable and popular emir. In 1774 Muhammad Bey founded his handsome madrasa opposite the Azhar, and there he lies in his tomb. It was built on the plan of an earlier mosque at Bulak, the Senanaya, and was, quote, a marvel of architecture and richness, gilded ceilings, marble porticos, and stupendous dome with bronze dormers admirably worked, into quote, etc. There were porticos for the Hanafis, Malakis, and Shafis, and celebrated doctors came to profess the law there, and contrary to the usual custom, received salaries some as much as 150 paras a day. You could sometimes buy a pound of meat for 2 paras, and none less than 10 paras a day, and an annual gift of 50 bushels of corn. On the day of opening, the great man clothed the divines with cloaks of sables or white fur, according to their rank, a handsome form of university hood. Muhammad Bey's is the last of the great mosques of Cairo, with the exception of Muhammad Ali's sumptuous and very effective mosque in the citadel, where it forms a conspicuous feature in the view from every side. This, however, is too obviously a foreign importation, a child of Istanbul, to harmonize with the true Cairo style, and though it is perhaps a narrow prejudice, we confess we can never quite reconcile ourselves to Ottoman architecture in the old Mamluk city. End of section 18. Section 19 of the Story of Cairo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Cairo by Stanley Lane-Poole. Section 19. Chapter 9. Beys and Pashas, Part 2. Enough has been said to show that it was not during the rule of Pashas and Beys that the mosques of Cairo suffered damage or demolition. They were well cared for. Their evil day came when Muhammad Ali, a second but more successful Ali Bey, made himself master of Egypt and inaugurated a new regime, compared with which the rule of the sternest of the Mamluks was mildness itself. It was Muhammad Ali who, in 1808 to 1810, laid hands on the waqfs, or religious endowments, which the piety of many centuries had placed in trust for the maintenance of the mosques and colleges of Egypt, and amidst the tears and curses of all the ulema of Cairo deprived them of the right to control the sacred monuments confided to their charge. From this act of confiscation, when title deeds were lost or destroyed, and trust funds confused and malversed, dates the most serious decay of the monuments of Cairo. The Europeanizing movement of the 19th century, inevitable and in many ways most desirable as it was, brought with it a large destruction of mosques and other historic buildings which impeded carriage traffic or stood in the way of the new streets and squares which the viceroys of Egypt planned with little or no regard to existing antiquities. The Sharif Muhammad Ali was the most flagrant example of a street cutting its way remorselessly through historic monuments, but similar vandalism occurred in almost every part of the city, and the department which attends to the alignment of the streets has often exercised its powers in the narrowest spirit of county counciledom. That much worse has not happened is wholly due to the vigilance and firmness of the Commission for the Preservation of the Monuments of Arab Art, an official body in which, happily, large powers are vested and to which we owe the maintenance of a multitude of Saracenic monuments of every class and all periods, which, but for its timely interposition, would now have disappeared or have been on the high road to ruin. It is impossible to overestimate the excellent and patient work of the Commission. The 17 annual reports it has issued, solid volumes with plans and illustrations, form a library of valuable information and testify in every page to the care and sense of responsibility shown by the members. It may here be permitted to quote a report on the results and methods of the Commission, which I made at Earl Cromer's request in 1895, and which was published in his annual survey of the progress of Egypt presented to Parliament in 1896. The Athenaeum, London, December 12, 1895. Quote, My Lord, in accordance with your Lordship's invitation, I have the honor to submit a few remarks on the work of the Commission for the Preservation of Arab Monuments, of which I made a detailed examination in the summer of this year. The Commission was instituted by decree of His Highness the late Khedive on the 18th December 1881. Its duties were 1. To make an inventory of the Arab monuments of Egypt which possessed historical or artistic interest. 2. To watch over the preservation of these monuments and report to the Minister of Waqfs such repairs as were considered necessary for their maintenance. 3. To prepare plans for such repairs and scrupulously superintend their execution. 4. To see that plans of all the work executed should be preserved in the Ministry of Waqf, and to indicate any fragments or detached objects which should be transferred to the Museum of Arab Art. Political disturbance prevented much being done before the close of 1882, but when I made a general inspection of the Arab monuments of Cairo in January to March 1883, the Commission was in working order. I was then able to see the beginning of its labors, and am therefore in a position to compare the state of the monuments at the time when the Commission first took them as seriously in hand with their present condition after the Commission has been over 12 years at work. I can state with confidence that comparing the general state of the mosques in 1883 and 1895, they are in a far safer and better preserved condition now than they were 12 years ago. Several monuments that then seemed inevitably doomed to destruction have been strengthened and supported, and generally speaking, weak places have been detected and repaired, whilst a more vigilant supervision and protection against vandalism and robbery now prevail. These happy results are especially due to the energy and archaeological or technical knowledge of the late Rogers Bey, of Franz Pasha, and of His Excellency Jakub Artin Pasha, whose name will always be honorably associated with the intellectual progress of Egypt. Some of their French colleagues have also rendered useful services from time to time, and the presence on the commission of successive under-secretaries of public works, and notably at the present time of Mr. now Sir W. E. Garstin, has proved a valuable source of strength. The most vital appointment under the commission is, of course, that of the architect who surveys the monuments, recommends such repairs as are necessary or desirable, and personally superintends their execution. Since the creation of the special department, Bureau Spécial, of the Commission, which was separated at the beginning of 1890 from the Bureau Technique of the Works, Mr. Max Hertz, Honorable F.S.A., has been the architect in charge of the work of the Commission, and it is bare justice to say that to his industry and considerable technical and archaeological attainments, much of the present improved manner of supervising and preserving the monuments is undoubtedly due. Hertz Bey joins to technical training of an architect a familiarity with the history of Arab art, together with a genuine enthusiasm for his work. His "Catalogue of the Arab Museum," published this year in French, but shortly to be reissued in an English translation, published 1896, furnishes proofs of an extensive study of the periods of development of Arab or Saracenic art, and of the literature, Arabic and European, relating to this subject, and the complete restorations he has made of a few of the smaller mosques are evidence of his insight into Arab construction and decoration, of his technical skill, and of his scrupulous fidelity to the original design. On this vexed subject of restoration, however, I shall have something to say later, but whatever may be thought of the principle, it is impossible to doubt that in the appointment of Hertz Bey the Commission has been exceptionally fortunate. Preservation. It must never be forgotten that the prime duty of the Commission is the preservation, not the restoration, of the monuments. A fairly complete list of the monuments which, on historical or artistic grounds, ought to be preserved has been drawn up by Subcommittee 1, and the first obligation laid upon the Commission is to watch over the preservation of every monument in this list. So far as my observation went, its members are clearly alive to this obligation, and have endeavored to fulfill it as far as their limited funds permitted. To enumerate the long catalogue of repairs from the establishing of the entire walls of a mosque to the removal of whitewash or dirt from a carved inscription or a mosaic would extend these notes to an undue length. The details may be read in the excellent annual reports of the Commission, which, if they are scarcely as prompt in their appearance as they might be, leave little to be desired in point of accuracy or completeness. Much more, however, remains to be done, and many of the repairs already executed can only be regarded as temporary, cheap makeshifts, pending the possibility of more thorough works when finances permit. The adequate and enduring preservation of the monuments is essentially a question of money. The Commission and its architect know what ought to be done, but they cannot do it without an increased staff and a larger budget. Meanwhile, there are 2 or 3 points to which the attention of the Commission should, I think, be especially and immediately directed, since they can be dealt with even on the present insufficient annual grant. 1. In cases where a thorough repair would be too costly to be undertaken on the present budget, there is a mode of preservation in a literary and artistic sense, which ought to be invariably adopted when there is any risk of further immediate decay. The great mosque of Sultan Hassan is an instance in point. In such a case, where many thousands of pounds would be required for substantial preservation, the Commission cannot at present entertain the plans which have been drawn up for so elaborate a work, but what they can do is to prepare an exact record of the present state of the mosque, to draw full architectural plans and elevations, photograph every detail of ornament or inscription, reproduce mosaics and other colored decoration in the colors of the originals, and generally to make it possible at any time to reproduce the entire mosque in its true proportions and exact details of ornament. Footnote. This has been done in the case of Sultan Hassan in the sumptuous work Le Marquis de Sultan Hassan au Caire, par Max Hertz Bey, published by the Commission 1899. End of footnote. To students of the history of Arab art, such a record would be invaluable, whilst it would make the task of preservation possible, even should want of funds postpone the work till the mosque had fallen into much more lamentable decay. To prepare such records would necessitate an increase in the staff of the commission, but if the memoirs were published with adequate historical introductions and explanations, the sale would probably repay a large part of the expense. At the same time, these records should not, of course, be regarded as a substitute for actual preservation or as a reason for deferring necessary repairs. They should be used merely as a safeguard against the total or partial obliteration of a monument by a sudden catastrophe which might happen any day to one of the minarets of Sultan Hassan, and not as a ground for refusing to avert the ruin. 2. Another and much simpler precaution should be taken in the case of the numerous small mosques of Cairo which are more or less roofed in. These have generally windows open places or grill work and often a small opening in the center over the court. The central opening should be covered with glass to keep out the weather, and the open windows should invariably be furnished with wire netting outside to exclude the birds which do much mischief in the interiors. All covered in mosques require frequent inspection with this view, and every cranny which could admit rain or birds should be carefully stopped. 3. A more expensive but absolutely necessary step is the compulsory expropriation of the shops or booths which cling like limpets to the facades of many of the mosques. The proprietors of these shops use the mosque behind as dustbins and throw their refuse and broken crockery through the windows. The appearance of the mosque, both inside and out, is seriously impaired by these excrescences which narrow the street. For example, the souk and nahasin impede traffic and prevent the facades of the mosque being seen in their true proportion and effect. In order to avoid the risk of any historical monument being overlooked and neglected, it would be well if the Commission were to divide Cairo into a certain number of definite quarters, and that the scheduled monuments in each quarter should be periodically visited by the subcommittee of inspection and the architect at least once a year. The number of monuments in the list is so large that it might be impossible to arrange more than 1 or 2 inspections of each in every season. Such visits should be recorded with notes on the condition of each monument in a special book. An important question is that of the private monuments, whether mosques, houses, sebels, wakalas, or other buildings. The government apparently has no power either to compel owners to maintain and preserve the historical buildings which they inhabit, or let, or to force them to sell. The few medieval houses still standing in Cairo are artistically more valuable than the mosque maintained by private waqfs, for they form almost the sole remaining examples of the domestic style of Arab art. It is greatly to be wished that they could be brought under the control of the Commission, and if due compensation were made for ejectment or interference, the owners would have little ground for complaint. Restoration. The Commission has not confined its labor strictly to preservation. It has also undertaken the complete restoration of several monuments. There is a well-founded prejudice in artistic and archaeological circles against restoration of any and every description, but I believe that an examination of some of the recent restorations carried out by Hertz Bey would remove these natural and generally just apprehensions. This architect's principle, as he explained it to me, appears sound and reasonable. It is this: no unique monument, for example, the Mosque of Ibn Tulun, or a monument belonging to an architectural period of which there are very few examples, for example, the Fatimid mosques, must on any account be restored. Preservation is the only possible treatment for such cases, and nothing more must be done than is absolutely necessary for the stability of the building and its security from weather and other injury. But when there are numerous mosques of the same period, nearly resembling one another in style and often even in detail of ornament, for example, in the period of Kate Bey, then a few may safely be selected for complete restoration at all points, so as to present as nearly as possible their original appearance as when first opened for public worship. Hertz Bey has given a few examples of his theory of restoration in mosques of a well-represented period. They are not equally successful, and it is evident from the latest specimens that experience has taught him much, especially in regard to color, but I think the most rigid opponent of restoration would find very little to criticize in the careful and beautiful manner in which the little mosque of Qadi Abu Bakr ibn Mutzer in the Bargawan has been restored to almost its original condition. and whatever may be said about the tampering to which the Mosque of El Mayad was subjected under a former regime, there is no doubt that the inscriptional frieze and the painted ceiling have been restored as perfectly and as scrupulously as skill and knowledge could attain. I can assert from personal observation that nothing can exceed the care and precautions which are observed by the architect of the commission in order to make sure that he has really discovered the original design and coloring beneath centuries of dirt and whitewash, or the pains he takes to reproduce them faithfully. And I may here observe that the staff of the commission includes workers in metal and wood who are able to copy the designs so accurately that it is almost impossible to distinguish them from the originals. They are not yet successful in stained glass, however. This merit has the obvious drawback that unless great care is taken, the details of the monuments, for example, the bronze bosses and plaques on doors, or the wood and ivory carvings and inlaid work of doors and minbars, may be falsified. In recent restorations of Arabic inscriptions, the inscription itself is made to tell the date of its restoration, but many small details of ornament are not distinguished at all from the original work whose gaps they supply. This defect calls for immediate correction before the distinction is forgotten by the restorers themselves. Every plaque of metal or panel of wood or mosaic should bear an unmistakable distinguishing mark, such as the date of restoration in Arabic ciphers, and detailed plans of all restored monuments should be preserved in the archives of the commission, in which the new portion should be clearly distinguished by color or shading. If this rule is carefully observed, I confess I can see nothing but advantage in the complete restoration of a limited number of mosques under the restrictions already mentioned, when the work is executed with the skill and honesty which one observes in the case of the mosque of Abu Bakr ibn Muzir. There is no falsification, but rather preservation in the most complete and satisfactory sense. The beauty of these restored mosques seems to appeal to the eyes of the worshippers, and there is no doubt that the Mosque of El Mayad has been far more frequented for prayer since its lawan was restored to something of its original beauty and richness of golden color. This is a consideration to which the Ministry of Waqfs can hardly fail to attach considerable importance. At the same time, there is possibly some risk of the vital work of preservation being sometimes neglected in order that restorations which are naturally more interesting and effective to both the architect and the public should be carried out. At present there are 5 mosques in course of restoration. Footnote. All these are now completed. End of footnote. Viz. Those of Zain ed-Din Yahya near the Musky, Gam el Banat of Hasan Buga in the Darb es Saada, and of Kagmas el-E Shaki besides El Bayad, and Abu Bakr ibn Muzir, which may be regarded as finished. 2 of these mosques, however, are private waqfs and are being paid for by private persons. Still, in my opinion, enough restoration has been undertaken for the present, and the chief attention of the Commission should be directed for the next 2 or 3 years to a fresh and complete examination of all the monuments on their list with a view to their thorough preservation. At all events, the selection of a new mosque for a complete restoration should be a subject of anxious thought and should not be lightly undertaken. Restoration, it must be remembered, is costly and cannot judiciously be embarked upon so long as the funds of the Commission are scarcely sufficient for preservation alone. Such, my lord, are the conclusions which suggested themselves to me after my inspection of the results of the Commission's labors. I've confined my remarks to Cairo because I had no opportunity this year to examine the work that has been done in other towns of Egypt. In Cairo, as I have endeavored to show, the Commission has done excellent work and has accomplished a great deal in face of inadequate funds and frequent obstruction and opposition. The few suggestions and criticisms I have ventured to make are trifles in comparison with the quantity and generally high quality of the work of preservation and restoration carried out under the authority of the Commission. In my opinion, the Waqf and the public works together should raise the annual budget of the Commission to £10,000 and then leave it to manage its own affairs as it is fully competent to do. Were it possible to create a Ministry of Fine Arts which should include the Archaeological Directorate as well as the Commission, the Giza as well as the Arab Museum, this would probably be the most satisfactory course, but the consideration of so thorough a reconstruction is beyond the scope of the report which your lordship has asked me to submit. End of quote. To these remarks I have nothing to add. All subsequent observation has confirmed the belief that the Commission has done and is still doing a noble work for the monuments of Cairo. The passages omitted in the preceding extracts related to the financial status of the Commission and the result of these recommendations as thus stated in Lord Cromer's covering report, which also strongly supported the various suggestions offered for the better protection of the monuments and added some excellent provisions for the inclusion of the Coptic churches in the field of operation of the Commission. Lord Cromer wrote, quote, I have for long been well aware that the grants heretofore obtained from the Waqf administration were inadequate, and that if greater activity was to be displayed in this branch of the administration, additional expenditure would have to be incurred. Indeed, one of the main objects I had in view in consulting Mr. Stanley Lane-Poole was to obtain suggestions from him as to the best method of spending more money, supposing it to be available. On receipt of Mr. Stanley Lane-Poole's report, I placed myself in communication with the authorities of the Financial and Public Works Department, with the result that a proposal was made to the Commissioners of the Public Debt that they should grant a sum of £20,000 from the reserve fund at their disposal to be spent under the direction of the Preservation Committee during the years 1896 and 1897. I am glad to say that this proposal was received by the Commissioners in a very friendly spirit. The money has been granted, and the details of their expenditure now alone remain to be settled. I should add that in addition to £20,000, which is to be spent exclusively on works of different sorts, the Egyptian government has consented to give a permanent grant of £1,000 a year from the Treasury in order to provide for the additional staff, which will without doubt be required. End of quote. The effects of this munificent addition to the funds placed at the disposal of the Commission have been far-reaching. The list of monuments that have benefited by the timely succor is too long to quote, but the repairs effected in the great mosque of El Mawridani at a cost of £4,000 must be specially mentioned. It was a work greatly needed, and the money has been well spent. Every visitor to Cairo is struck by the difference in the condition of the mosques since the Commission took them under its charge. Many which seemed doomed are now safe, others have their lives at least prolonged, and no fragment of Arab arts, no vestige of the city wall, no piece of carving or inscription is beneath the watchful care of the Commission. When a monument cannot be preserved, such fragments of ornament or inscriptions as remain are carefully gathered and transported to the Arab Museum, which itself is evidence of the good work that has been done in the past 20 years. These years have indeed been fruitful in serious labor to repair the injury which natural decay and unnatural confiscation, neglect, and vandalism have worked in the past upon the relics of medieval Cairo. End of section 19.
Section 20 of The Story of Cairo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonia. The Story of Cairo by Stanley Lane-Poole. Section 20. Appendix Rulers and Monuments of Cairo. 1. Arab Period. AD 640 to 868. AH 20 to 254. Rulers. 98 governors under caliphs of Damascus and Baghdad built Mosque of Amr in AH 21. Town of the Tent El Fustat in AH 21. First Nilometer at Roda in AH 98. Faubourg El Askar in AH 133. Second Nilometer at Roda in AH 247. 2. Turkish period. House of Trulun. AD 868. AH 254. Ruler Ahmad ibn Tulun built Faubourg el-Khattai in AH 256. Palaces of El-Khattai in AH 256 following. Maristan in AH 259. Mosque of Ibn Tulun in AH 263 to 265. AD 883. AH 270. Ruler Humara ibn Ahmad built Palaces of El-Khattai in AH 270 following. AD 895, AH 282. Ruler Geish ibn Humaraway. AD 896, AH 283. Ruler Harun ibn Humaraway. AD 904, AH 292. Ruler Shayban ibn Ahmad ibn Tulun. Caliphs, governors. AD 905 to 934, AH 292 to 323. Rulers, 13 governors. House of El-Irshid. AD 934, AH 323. Ruler Muhammad el-Irshid. Built palace in Kafur's garden and at Roda. AD 946, AH 334. Ruler Abu Qasim Ungur ibn al-Irshid. Built Maristan at Fustat in AH 346. AD 960, AH 349. Ruler Abul Hassan Ali ibn al-Irshid. Built Mosque of El-Giza in AH 350. AD 966, AH 355. Ruler Abul Mis Kafur. AD 968, AH 358. Ruler Abul Fawaris Ahmad ibn Ali. 3. Fatimid period. AD 969, AH 358. Ruler El-Mu'iz. Built foundation of El-Qahira in AH 358. Great East Palace, etc. in AH 358. Mosque El-Ajar in AH 359. AD 975, AH 365. Ruler El-Aziz. Built West Palace, etc. Mosque of El-Hakim in AH 380 to 403. AD 996, AH 386. Ruler El-Hakim. Built Mosque of Rashida in AH 393 to 395. Mosque of El-Maqs. AD 1021, AH 411. Ruler Ez-Zahir. AD 1036, AH 427. Ruler El-Mustansir. Built Mosque El-Guyushi in AH 478. Bab al-Nasr. Bab al-Futuh. Second wall. Bab Zuwayla in AH 480 to 484. Mosque of Nilometer in AH 485. AD 1094, AH 487. Ruler El-Mustali. AD 1101, AH 495. Ruler El-Amir. Built Mosque El-Akmar in AH 519. Several mesgids, Yanis, Kafuri, Bab el-Khawkha, Mihrabs of Ajar and Sayyida Ruqayya. AD 1131, AH 524. Ruler El-Hafiz. AD 1149, AH 544. Ruler Ez-Zafir. Built Mosque El-Afhar in AH 543. AD 1154, AH 549. Ruler El-Faiz. AD 1160, AH 555. Ruler El-Adid. Built Mosque of Es-Sali Talai in AH 555. 4. House of Saladin. AD 1169, AH 565. Ruler En-Nasir Salaeddin Saladin ibn Ayyub. Built Mosque of Negmeddin Ayyub in AH 566, College Nasiriyah in AH 566, College Qamhiyah in AH 566, College Qutbiyah in AH 570, College Ibn al-Arsufi in AH 570, College Suyufiyah in AH 572. Citadel and Third Wall begun in AH 572. Maristan in AH 575. College al-Fadiliyah in AH 580. AD 1193. AH 589. Ruler al-Aziz, son of Saladin, built Mosque of Ibn al-Bena in AH circa 591. College Ushkushiyah in AH 592. AD 1198. AH 595. Ruler al-Mansur ibn al-Asis built College Ghaznaviyah. AD 1200. AH 596. Ruler al-Adil Seyfeddin built College Adiliyah, College Sherifiyah in AH 612. AD 1218. AH 615. Ruler al-Kamil ibn al-Adil, restoration of Mosque of Shafi in AH 607. Built College Kamiliyah in AH 622. College Fakhriya in AH 622. Zawiya Kasri in AH circa 633. Mosque Ibn al-Sheikhi in AH circa 633. AD 1238. AH 635. Ruler al-Adil II Ibn al-Kamil built College Sayramiyah in AH circa 636. College Faiziyah in AH 636. AD 1240. AH 637. Ruler as-Sali Ayub ibn al-Kamil built College Salihiyah in AH 639. Mosque etc. of El-Roda. AD 1249. AH 647. Ruler al-Muassam Turan Shah ibn al-Sali built Zawiya Khadam in AH 647. 5. Turkish Mamluks. AD 1250. AH 648. Ruler Queen Sheger-ed-Dur built Tomb of as-Sali in AH 648. AD 1250. AH 648. Ruler al-Mo'is Aybek built College Qutbiyah in AH 650. College Sahibiyah in AH 654. AD 1257. AH 655. Ruler al-Mansur Ali ibn Aybek. AD 1259. AH 657. Ruler al-Muzaffar Qutuz. AD 1260. AH 658. Ruler al-Zahir Baybars built College Zahiriya in AH 660. Meshed al-Hosseini in AH 662. College Megdiya in AH 663. Mosque al-Afram in AH 663. Mosque al-Zahir in AH 665. College Muheddibiyah, College Farikania in AH 676. AD 1277. AH 676. Ruler as-Sa'id Baraka ibn Baybars. AD 1279. AH 678. Ruler al-Adil Selamish ibn Baybars. AD 1279. AH 679. Ruler al-Mansur Qalawun built College Mansuria and Maristan Qalawun in AH 684, Zawiya el-Gemisi in AH 682, Zawiya el-Gabari in AH 687, Zawiya el-Halawi in AH 683, Convent el-Bundukdaria in AH 688. AD 1290, AH 689. Ruler el-Ashraf Khalil ibn Kalaun, built gate from Akka. AD 1293, AH 693. Ruler en-Nasir Muhammad ibn Kalaun. AD 1294, AH 694. Ruler el-Adil Kebura. AD 1296, AH 696. Ruler el-Mansur Lagin. Restoration of Mosque of Ibn Tulun in AH 696. Built College Tafagia in AH circa 698. College Manguti Muria in AH 698. AD 1298, AH 698. Ruler en-Nasir, second reign. Built College Nasiria in AH 699 to 703. College Karasun Kuria in AH 700. College Gemalia in AH 703. Restoration of Hakim Ajar Talai in AH 703 to 704. Mosque of Taibars in 707. AD 1308, AH 708. Ruler el-Muzaffar Baybars Gashnekir, built Convent of Baybars in AH 706 to 709. AD 1309, AH 709. Ruler en-Nasir, third reign, built College Taibarsia in AH 709. Zawiya of el-Himsi in AH 709. Mosque of el-Gaki in AH 713. Citadel Palace Aqueduct in AH 713. College Saidia in AH 715. Convent of Arslan in AH circa 717. Mosque of Citadel in AH 718. Mosque of Emir Hussein in AH 719. College Al-Melikia in AH 719. College Gawalia in AH 723. Tomb of Ordutegin in AH 724. College Mimandaria in AH 725. College Buktumuria in AH 726. Mosque of El-Khazani in AH 729. Mosque of Almas in AH 730. Mosque of El-Barqiya in AH 730. Mosque of Kusun in AH 730. Mosque of Saruga in AH circa 730. College Akburavia in AH 734. Tomb of Tashtimur in AH 734. Palace of Beshtak in AH circa 735. Convent of Kusun in AH 736. Convent at Syriacus in AH 736. Mosque of Beshtak in AH 736. Mosque of Aydemir in AH 737. Mosque of Et-Turkmani in AH 738. Mosque of El-Maridani in AH 740. Mosque of Sita Miska in AH 740. Mosque of Ibn Razi in AH 741. AD 1341, AH 741. Ruler el-Mansur Abu Bakr, son of en-Nasir. AD 1341, AH 742. Ruler el-Ashraf Kubuk, son of en-Nasir. AD 1342, AH 742. Ruler en-Nasir Ahmad, son of An-Nasir. AD 1342, AH 743. Ruler as-Salih Ismail, son of An-Nasir, built Mosque of at-Tawashi in AH 745. AD 1345, AH 746. Ruler al-Kamil Shaban, son of An-Nasir, built Mosque of Ibn at-Tabah in AH 746. AD 1346, AH 747. Ruler al-Muzaffar Hagi, son of An-Nasir, built Mosque of Kuguk in AH 747. AD 1347, AH 748. Ruler An-Nasir Hassan, son of An-Nasir, built Mosque of Aksunkur in AH 747. Mosque of al-Ismaili in AH 748. Mosque of Kutlubura in AH 748. Mosque of al-Asyuti in AH circa 749. Convent of Anuk in AH circa 749. Convent of Al-Gibura in AH circa 750. Mosque of Mangak in AH 750. Mosque of Sheikhu in AH 750. College of El-Kharuba in AH 750. Cistern of Lagin in AH 750. College Kaisarania in AH 751. College Sarira in AH 751. AD 1351, AH 752. Ruler as-Salih ibn Nasir. AD 1354, AH 755. Ruler Hassan, second reign. Built Convent of Sheikhu in AH 756. College Farisiya in AH 756. College Sarid Mishia in AH 756. College Sultan Hassan in AH 757 following. College Bediriya in AH 758. College Higaziya in AH 761. College Beshiria in AH 761. College Sabikia in AH 763. AD 1361, AH 762. Ruler al-Mansur Muhammad, grandson of An-Nasir. AD 1363, AH 764. Ruler al-Ashraf Shaban, grandson of An-Nasir, built Tomb of Turbia in AH 765. Mosque of Shaban in AH 771. College Bubekriya Asunbura in AH 772. College of Gayal Yusufi in AH 775. College of Bakriya in AH circa 775. AD 1376, AH 778. Ruler al-Mansur Ali ibn Shaban built College of Ibn Iram in AH 782. AD 1381, AH 783. Ruler as-Salih Hagi ibn Shaban, deposed 1382, restored 1389-90, built Tomb of Salih in AH 783. 6 Circassian Mamluks. AD 1382, AH 784. Ruler as-Zahir Barkuk interrupted 791-792 by Hagi, built Tomb of Anas in AH 783, College of Aitmish in AH 785, College of Barkuk in AH 788, Mosque of Zaineddin in AH 790, College of Inal Ustadar in AH 795, College of Mahmudiya in AH 797, College of Mukbil Zemmamiya in AH 797, College of Ibn Rurab in AH 798. AD 1399, AH 801. Ruler En-Nasir Farag ibn Barkuk, built Mosque of Ibn Abdel-Zahir in AH 803, College of Sudun in AH 804, College of Mahali in AH circa 806. AD 1405, AH 808. Ruler El-Mansur Abdel-Aziz ibn Barkuk, built convent and tomb of Barkuk and Farag and college of Farag in AH 803 to 813. AD 1405, AH 809. Ruler Farag, second reign, built college of Gemal ed-Din in AH 811, Mosque of Hosh, citadel, in AH 812. AD 1412, AH 815. Ruler El-Mustayin, Caliph, built Mosque of Birket el-Rakli in AH 814. AD 1412, AH 815. Ruler El-Muayyad Sheikh, built Mosque of Ed-Diva, citadel, in AH 815. Mosque of El-Basiti in AH 817. Mosque of El-Hanafi in AH 817. Mosque of Ez-Zahid in AH 818. Maristan of El-Muayyad in AH 818. Mosque of El-Muayyad in AH 819 to 823. College of Abdelrani in AH 821. Mosque of El-Fakhri in AH 821. College of Qadi Abdel-Basit in AH 823. AD 1421, AH 824. Ruler El-Muzaffar Ahmad ibn Sheikh. AD 1421, AH 824. Ruler Ez-Zahir Tatar. AD 1421, AH 824. Ruler Es-Salih Muhammad ibn Tatar. AD 1422, AH 825. Ruler El-Ashraf Bars Bey, built College of Bars Bey in AH 827. Mosque of Ghani Bek in AH 830. College of Fairuz in AH 830, Convent and Tomb of Bars Bey in AH 835. AD 1438, AH 842. Ruler El-Aziz Yusuf ibn Bars Bey. AD 1438, AH 842. Ruler Ez-Zahir Gakmak, built College of Tari Berdi in AH 844. Mosque of Qani Bey in AH 845. AD 1453, AH 857. Ruler El-Mansur Othman ibn Gakmak, built mosque and tomb Qadi Yahya in AH 848 to 850. Mosque of Gakmak in AH 853. AD 1453, AH 857. Ruler El-Ashraf Inal, built college, convent, tomb of Inal in AH 855 to 860. AD 1461, AH 865. Ruler El-Muayyad Ahmad ibn Inal. AD 1461, AH 865. Ruler Ez-Zahir Khushqadam, built tomb of Ghani Bek in AH 869. Mosque of Nur-Eddin in AH 870. Mosque of Sudun in AH circa 870. College of Qanim in AH circa 870. AD 1467, AH 872. Ruler Ez-Zahir Yelbey. AD 1467, AH 872. Ruler Ez-Zahir Timur-Bura. AD 1468, AH 873. Ruler El-Ashraf Qaid Bey, Built Mosque of Timras in AH 876. Mosque of Esbek ibn Tutush in AH 880. Palace of Yeshbek in AH 880. Qaid Bey's College and Tomb in AH 879. Qaid Bey's College in Town in AH 880. Qaid Bey's Wekala by Ajar in AH 882. Qaid Bey's Sebil in AH 884. Qaid Bey's Wekala Baben Nasser in AH 885. Qaid Bey's Wekala Surugia in AH circa 885. Qaid Bey's Fadawiya Cupola in AH circa 886. Qaid Bey's Palace and Meccan in AH 890. Qaid Bey's Restoration of South Gates in AH 890. Qaid Bey's College at El Roda in AH 896. Mosque of Ghanim in AH 883. College of Abu Bakr ibn Mujir in AH 885. Mosque of Kagmas in AH 886. College of Esbek el-Yusufi in AH 900. AD 1496, AH 901. Ruler N. Nasir Muhammad ibn Qaid Bey built Palace of Mamai Beit al-Qadi in AH 901. AD 1498, AH 904. Ruler Ez-Zahir Khonsu built Tomb of Khonsu in AH 904. AD 1500, AH 905. Ruler El-Ashraf Ganbalat AD 1501, AH 906. Ruler El-Adil Tuman Bey AD 1501, AH 906. Ruler El-Ashraf Khonsu el-Rui built Tomb El-Adil Tuman Bey in AH 906. Mosque of Khirbek in AH 908. College Khani Bek Emir Akhor in AH 908. College of El-Rui in AH 909. Tomb Mosque of El-Rui in AH 909. Tomb of Sudun in AH circa 910. College of Khani Bek Kara in AH 911. Restoration of aqueduct to citadel in AH 911. AD 1516, AH 922. Ruler El-Ashraf Tuman Bey AD 1517, AH 922. Ottomanly conquest of Egypt. End of section 20. End of the story of Cairo by Stanley Lane-Poole.